And these are the days of the harvest. The fields are as white and gold. And we are the laborers in your vineyard, declaring the word of the Lord. Behold, he comes, riding on the clouds, shining like the sun. Have the trumpet call, so lift your voice. It's the year of Jubilee, and down in Zion's hill salvation comes. Please be seated.
Well, good morning. Good. Oh, this thing's off. Well, it's good to see all of you here this morning. Glad that you could be here and to be a part of us. Thank you, Adrian, for leading us in those songs. And yes, every time that anybody requests ones, they need to sing out even more, right? When they do that. So it is good that we're all here together. Got to make sure all these things work up here this morning. One quick announcement for those who are planning on going to the what's that thing called? Back to School Bash. Yeah, the Back to School Bash in Ellijay. It has been canceled. Ellijay, the congregation up there, has had an outbreak of quite a few people, including a youth minister with COVID, and so it has been canceled, and it will be virtual. So if you want to watch it, go online and be a part of that to watch it that way. Definitely something we've got to be watching out and praying for and being careful ourselves with everything that we are doing with today. The message I want to speak to you today and talk to you about is something, quite honestly, that has been heavily on my heart for a very long time, especially over the last few years. And what I want to talk about, it is very important to me. It's something that I am really passionate about, because I believe that it is the answer to reaching people for Christ. I believe that what we are going to talk about today is something that, when it comes down to it, we can talk about different programs. You can talk about, well, here's what we need to do, here's how we need to do it. When it all comes down to it, it comes down to the one point of what we're going to talk about this morning, and that's about valuing people. Everything that we face in our society and in our culture and the things that we deal with on a daily basis comes down to this. And what I want to talk about is how I learned, and some of the steps along the way over the last few years, to how to value people more and how to really put this into effect. And the reason why this message is really heavy in my heart, because at this time in our country and in our society and our culture and even our world as a whole, instead of valuing people, we devalue people. Instead of coming together, we're divisive. And if I'm honest in the way I look at it, I truly believe it breaks the heart of God when he sees his creation divisive with each other and fighting with each other. And so some of you have asked, you have changed over the last 7 years. For those who do not know, I left here about 7 years ago to go work in Montgomery, to work at Faulkner University, and that since I've come back, some of you have said, you're different. Well, maybe because there's a little more gray. Oh, my hair. Maybe some of that. Maybe we hope that what it's called is maturity. I know that it is still out for some of that, if that's really what this is. I get that. But no, there has been some things, and part of it is what I really want to dive into this morning and talk about. And so some of this is going to be a little awkward because I'm going to talk more. This is kind of a different sermon than what I love to preach. What I'd rather preach is something to open up a passage and be expository and just preach from it. And this is more of a how-to lesson. This is more of a lesson that sits in here to really dive down. And what I want to talk about this morning is some things I think that God wants us to learn, that God, through his word, wants to show us, and even through some experiences that I've had that has changed my life over these last few years. And my goal this morning is that when you leave here this morning is that you will feel valued by God and others, and that you will go out and leave this building and be value connectors to other people. Because that's really what we're called to do. We are called to get into people's lives. We are called as Christians to be able to interact with people in our society and in our world and in our culture, and to be able to show them Jesus Christ living through us. And so instead of dividing, that we will be encouraging people to come together. So if you'll stick with me here for these next few moments, we're going to talk a little bit about that. And really what it comes down to, this foundational point, is the verse that you probably learned, one of the very first verses you learned before anything else, John 3:16. Probably it is the most popular verse in all of Scripture. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, his one and only Son, that we should not perish, but that every single one of us should have eternal life. But we always stop in verse 16 because verse 17 is just as important. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. And that is the foundational point for everything that we're talking about this morning. And if you really want to dive down into it, the thesis of this lesson this morning is that valuing people is essential in helping them find God. Because if you do not value somebody as a person, you're not going to help them find God. Because if you don't, it's truly impossible. Please don't miss what we're going to talk about here this morning. You see, because you and I have a choice in this culture we live in. We have the choice to either curse the darkness, which a lot of people do, or we have a choice to be a light in the world. Paul talks about this light in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 when he talks about this light that we have within us. It's found in these jars of clay. It is the light of Jesus that shines forth in our lives through everything that we struggle with. But you and I have to ask ourselves, how am I going to be in this life? Am I going to be one of those people that sits up and says, well, life is so difficult and everything that we're facing? Am I going to be somebody who's going to be discouraging and divisive? Or am I going to be what Jesus called me to be, salt and light in this world? And honestly, I believe we have two challenges in our culture today. The first challenge is that I believe we have lost our way as a society and as a culture in the ways of value. So much so that I believe when you look at research, for at least one generation, if not two generations, we have had these 2 to 3 generations grow up that haven't grown up learning and living out good values in their lives. Now, I'm not talking about people that go to church. I'm not talking about people right here. I'm talking about in general in our world, in our society, that research has shown that we have at least 1 or 2 generations that have grown up without values. And so because we have lost our way with values, we cease to value people. We cease to value God's created race. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, when God is creating there and he is sitting there with the Godhead, he says, let us make man in our image. Psalm 139 and verse 14, the psalmist writes that you and I are fearfully and we are wonderfully made. And so each of us has a purpose in this life. Of the 7+ billion people that live on this earth right now, you and I have a purpose in this life. You and I have value to other people, and most importantly, you and I have value to God. And we've got to get back to being a people that do that. And so when I talk about valuing people, I'm talking about valuing everyone. Now, we don't have a problem with me sitting up here teaching that we need to value people. I don't think anybody in here has a problem with that, as long as we're talking about the people we value, right? But we have a horrendous problem valuing people that are not like us, that may not talk like us, that may not look like us, who may not even have our values at all. And so you may be sitting there saying, well, John, this is a good lesson if you talk about valuing people I like. But if you're going to talk about valuing people I don't like, well, you know, we're just going to have to stop right here. Remember, my name is John and I love you, and we're friends. Because I believe this is something that we all need to hold on to. And so I think there's 7 value lessons that I want us to point out here quickly here this morning about things that we can do to value people more. Things that I've learned over the last few years of my life and things I believe that we can get from what God is trying to say. Y'all ready for this? So let's dive in here right now. Values lessons number 1 is how I value people determines how I view people. Luke chapter 15. We love the stories that you find in Luke chapter 15. You got the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the prodigal son. And we love all of that. I just, a couple of Wednesday nights ago, I spoke on a summer series in Alabama, and I was speaking directly about Luke chapter 15 and the story of the prodigal son. And verses 17 through 24 is the verses that we just love. It's so easy for preachers to preach. But you got to go back to verse 1 and 2 of why Jesus was telling these stories. Because if you go back to Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, you get the description there that Jesus is sitting here with publicans or tax collectors, depending on which translation you have, and sinners. And that the other Jewish people that were around them listening to them were wondering, what is Jesus doing with these people? He is eating with them. He is interacting with them. And then you have another story in Luke chapter 7. When Jesus is at a house of Simon the Pharisee, and it's probably all religious people there, and in the middle of dinner, here comes this woman and interrupts dinner, and she begins to kiss Jesus' feet. She begins to cry with her tears and wash his feet and anoint him with oil. And in verse 39, Simon says this about this woman: if he was really a prophet, he would know what type of woman she was. How we view people and how we value people will determine how we see them and how we interact with them. My mom passed away 2 years ago in June of 2019, about a month before her 75th birthday. And my mom was somebody, she was a little bit different. She was one of these people that really loved genealogy, and she could talk to you for 8, 9, 10 hours worth of genealogy. Some of you have people like that, I can tell. But when she was there and we're at the memorial service, a lady came up and she goes, let me tell you something about your mom. She goes, when I was sick, I always got a phone call from her, or I got a card from her, or somebody. She cared about me when other people didn't care. My mom taught for years in the inner city of Jacksonville, Florida. And I always asked her, I said, why are you teaching in the inner city? Why aren't you teaching more of home where we're at? And she said this, she goes, because who's going to do it if we don't? And my mom always taught me that as soon as I graduated college, she always said, if you're going to be a preacher, if you're going to go into ministry, you've got to love and value people. Because if you don't, nobody's going to want to listen to hear anything that you have to say. And so every lesson that I do, every class that I teach, whatever it may come down to, if it's a devotional or whatever, I have this in the back of my mind that I have got to value people, because how I value determines how I view people. Don't miss this. My value of people determines my perspective of people. In Luke, in those passages from Luke 15 and Luke 7, these were fellow Jewish people that looked upon their own brothers and their own sisters with disdain, and they had their own categories for them. They were publicans, they were prostitutes, they were sinners, and they looked down upon them, and they didn't want Jesus to have anything to do with them. But yet when Jesus saw them, he saw them as valuable. So values lesson number 1 is I've got to view people as valuable. Values lessons number 2, though, leads right to it, is that I've got to value people. Whoops, let me get that to go there. I've got to value people as God values people. Matthew 28 is probably, we like to say, that's the Great Commission. That's the Great Commission of the church, verse 19. Go into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything that I command, and lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the age. And I'm not here to get down and break down to the Greek, but that word go there is what we call in Greek an adverbial participle. And literally it's translated while or as you are going. make disciples. As you enter in and you interact with people on a daily basis, make disciples in this world. Now, here's where our challenge comes in this. We encourage you, and over the next few weeks and months and whatever coming forward, I will encourage you, your elders will encourage you, we will be encouraging you to invite people to church. And don't misunderstand what I'm about to say, because that is a great thing, and we need to get people to come to be able to listen to the message, of the saving message of Jesus Christ. But we got to understand it's more than just coming to church. Trey was one of my students at Faulkner. He came to Faulkner. He was not a member of the church. He didn't come there. He came because he had a cheerleading scholarship. Church really wasn't a thing for him. But he had two friends on the cheerleading team who really cared deeply for him. And I remember after chapel one day, or after class, I cannot remember what it was, they came and said, "We want you to get Trey to come to church." I said, "Okay, we can do this. That's easy." And I liked Trey. We had interactions, and so I tried to be intentional about wanting to get him to come and invite him to come to church. And finally, after weeks of talking to him, I remember it was a Thursday, and it was sitting here after chapel. He said, "I'm going to come to church Sunday." And I said, "Oh, great. You can come. You sit by me. Don't worry about it. Don't be afraid. We'll be excited to have you." Well, Sunday never came for Trey, because he was heading home to Tuscaloosa. And he's on the back roads from Prattville to Tuscaloosa, and somewhere along the way, his car left the road. And that hurt, because I remember sitting there almost in an argument with God, but he was coming to church. And it was one of those situations where I was saying, but he was coming to church. But it was also one of those moments where I had to sit down and deeply look within myself to realize that I didn't value him enough to share my faith with him. It was more about coming to church. Jesus didn't say, "Go into all the world and invite them to church." Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Coming to church is a great thing, but coming to church doesn't change people. Jesus changes people. And we've got to remember that. He said, "Go into the world and make disciples of people." And I wonder if that's what was happening in Revelation chapter 2. In Revelation chapter 2, you've got the 7 churches of Asia that Jesus is beginning to talk to. And the first one he comes to is Ephesus. And he says, "Ephesus, they were like a model church in that time. You're doing all these great things." But he says in verse 4, "But I got a problem with you. You've left your first love. You left your priorities." Folks, our number one priority is sharing our faith with people. Because there are 7 billion people in this world, and the majority of them do not know Jesus Christ. And yes, we need to invite them to church, and yes, we needed to get them to come to things, but it's about sharing my faith, because I have to get back down and understand that when I share my faith, I value people as God values people. Which goes to the third lesson. That we've always have to put other people first. Always. We've heard, and I know you've heard all your life, about being a servant. John chapter 13, the perfect illustration of the night before Jesus is about to be crucified. He is sitting there, they're about to institute the Lord's Supper, and he gets down on his hands and knees and he washes his feet, and he shows the disciples what true servanthood is truly all about. And that's why Paul would sit here and write in Philippians chapter 2 that each one of us as Christians, we need to have this mind amongst ourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant. And being born in the likeness of man, and being found in human form, he humbled himself, even to death on the cross. Some of you in the business world, you will recognize this name, Zig Ziglar. He was a guy that was motivational and always did a lot of things. He has this moment of saying this. He says, if you will help people get what they want in life, they will help you get what you want in life. If you will go and you will value people and help people be successful, they will help you be successful. God has always called us to servanthood and placing people first. And when I finally got to grab a hold of this, I knew it was right to serve people. I've always known it was right to serve people, that this is what we were supposed to do. But when I started serving people, I started valuing people. And here's what I mean. Stay with me for a second. If I see you as hurting, I'll help you. If I see you as broken, I'll fix you. But if I see you as valuable, I'll serve you. Do you see the difference? When I see you as hurting, I help you. When I see you as broken, I fix you. That's about me. It's about what I'm doing for you. But when it becomes something where I value you, it becomes from a different mindset. It becomes, yes, you still may be hurting, yes, you may still be broken, but it comes from a mindset of I'm here to serve you, not about it's being about me fixing you. It's about us working together and helping you. It's always about putting people first. Always. Always, because there's going to come some times in your life that you've got to understand. The values lesson number 4 is that we can't let a bad experience become a lifetime experience. Mark Twain said this: if a cat jumps up on a hot stove, he'll jump off that stove. And that cat won't go near a cold stove either. He'll just stay away from stoves. Why? A bad experience. And folks, all of us have them. And what's interesting, when you talk about a person that had a bad experience, we always go to Job. After his bad experience, Job has interactions with his 3 friends. And if you kind of get through it, and man, we just don't have time to go through all of those points in here this morning. But if you ever go back and read the interaction between Job and his friends, you can almost see that Job gets to a point where he's frustrated with them and almost wants to put them aside because he doesn't want them to make his bad experience even worse. Now, some of you here, you know my story. You know some of the things that I've gone through. Some of you don't. If you don't know it, well, fine. We'll talk later about this. But for years, I realized it finally took a while, and somebody hitting me over the head, that I kept people at arm's distance for years because of a bad experience, because of being betrayed. Because I learned, guess what? The good news is, if I kept you at a distance, you couldn't hurt me. The problem is, if I kept you at a distance, you couldn't help me, and I couldn't help you. That's about 1.5 years ago. Somebody hit me in the head, and they said, you know what? You could be more effective as a minister if you would let people in. You know what I did? I went home and said, well, I'll keep that person at arm's distance too. But then I realized they were right. I was. Because of something bad that had happened to me, not because of anybody else's fault that I was around, I kept people at a distance away. And so I made that conscious decision. I remember sitting there and making that conscious decision that I would let them in. Even if people would hurt you, even whatever would take place, I would let them in. Right where they were. And I thought about Mark chapter 5. The demon-possessed man, Jesus comes to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and gets into the area of the Gerasenes there. And there's this demon-possessed man who had been demon-possessed for years. And he tortured the people in the town. And anytime they needed to, they tried to come and chain him up. They tried to come and do all these things just to keep him out of there. You think he had a bad experience? Well, yeah, he had a bad experience. But what's interesting is, in verse 18, he's begging Jesus to go with Jesus and say, let me show other people what God has done for me. And Jesus says in verse 19, no, I got something better. You go home and you show your friends, you show your family what God has done for you. And he could have sat back and he could have said, no, I've had a bad experience with these people. They chained me up. They left me in my time of need. When it wasn't my fault. I could instead of letting it become a bad experience and moving on, we make it become a lifetime experience and we build walls. Instead of embracing values and evaluating other people, we have a tendency to want to keep them away. But folks, I'm here to tell you, you can't let a bad experience become a lifetime experience. And when I understand that, and I finally get a hold of that, the fifth lesson that I get is that I understand that great values have a great return, that they come back to you. We've grown up with the great, the golden rule from Confucius, remember? Do unto others as they do unto you. But that's not what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Regardless of their interactions, regardless of what they do and how they treat you, do unto others as you want them to do about you. And this is a beautiful value that when I get a hold of it and I understand it, that this great value has a great return, and that, guess what? It's above any law that is out there. Galatians chapter 5 is something very interesting. We have in there this thing called the fruit of the Spirit in there. And this is something that should be within each of us as believers and followers of Christ. It is the fruit that comes from us as followers of Jesus Christ that the world sees. And he says, the fruit of the Spirit there in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. The fruit of the Spirit is love. It's joy. It's peace. It's forbearance or patience. It's kindness. I like one translation there. It says it's kindness in action. It's goodness. It's faithfulness. It's gentleness. And it's self-control. What are those? Values. But look at what he says here at the end of verse 23. Against such things, but there is no law. Folks, let me tell you something. Great values are greater than any law that could be passed. Let me tell you something. You can make every law in the land that you want to make, but if you don't have great values, you will break it. We do not have a law problem in America. If you look at the things that we face in our society, from social issues to racial issues to even the abortion issue, it's not about a law. It all comes down, do we value people? That's what it all wraps up in. We can sit here and we can argue about whether abortion should be legal or not, but it comes down, do we value that unborn life? And that's where it all starts. It starts right here in the heart. Right here with all of us. And so I got to have these great values. Because when we get on to number 6 here, we've got to be intentional in developing relationships with false people. We're about to get home on this. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul describes in verse 2 and 3 that we are letters of recommendation. In verse 3, he says, we are letters of recommendation not written on stones, but rather we're written on the human heart. We're all the same. And I know some of you have heard me say this in here. Martin Luther, when he was writing years ago, some 500 years ago, he said there are truly 5 gospels. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Christian is the life that they live. And I like what Paul says. And I wanted to show this up here because I really wanted to get, because it's something that I don't think we pay attention to a lot. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul begins here to write, for though I am free of all. Paul said, I became free for all of these things. But here's what I did. I made myself a servant to all, that I may win more. And watch what he says here, beginning verse 20. To the Jew, I became what Jews wanted to do. To those under the law, I became one of those under the law, talking about the law of Moses, that I may win those that are under the law. Well, look at what he says in verse 21. To those that are on the outside of the law, I became as one outside of the law. Not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that what? I may win some of those that are outside the law. Paul says, I went and lived amongst lost people. I interacted with lost people. I lived with them. I learned what they went through. I experienced some of the things that they went through and the things that they did. He made a commitment to take Christ to the people who would never come to church. Do you realize that there are people like that? And that's our charge, to share the love of God with people who would never enter a surrounding like we're in right now. And I'm going to say something, and it may be a little shocking. To do that, it can't happen in a place like this. The only way and only place that you may interact with some lost people is with lost people. And I know we love and we enjoy our time in coming together. But let me tell you what I found and what I learned is that the closer I got with people who were lost, the more I began to love and value them. Don't miss this. Is it surprising? It shouldn't be. In Mark, what you find throughout all of Mark, you see Jesus as he is seeing the crowd. What do you see? You read, he has compassion on them. Mark chapter 6 and verse 34, Jesus steps out of the boat. He sees a great crowd, and he has compassion for them because they were like a sheep that was out of shepherd. Folks, we're going to be very blunt here for a second. You don't get compassion for lost people in the church building. You don't get valuing and compassion for lost people through prayer. It's not something that just happens mystically that comes in. You get compassion for lost people by being with lost people. That's the only way that you and I can get it. It's not something that just mystically happens, but the moment that you see them and you see them hurting and you see their brokenness and you see their lostness, all of a sudden you begin to fall in love with them. You begin to sit here and say, wow. And we have to watch how we live and we show Christ and we show God in our lives. I talked recently to some about 2 years ago when we were in London doing a mission youth rally kind of thing over there. We went to Leicester Square, and it's kind of like, I don't know how you describe it, it's kind of like Times Square in New York City. And on one side of the square, there were Jehovah's Witnesses that had tents set up and trying to distribute literature and things. They didn't have a lot of people there. On the other side of the square, you had a local mosque, Islamic mosque, sitting there distributing information and water and things, and they were packed. And the people we were with, who were members of the church there in Wimbley, we asked them, I remember asking them, wow, you would not see this in America. Why? Why is it like this? And they said, well, over in the United Kingdom, in London in particular, everybody who claims Christ, whether they're Jehovah's Witness or Churches of Christ or whatever, Church of England, whatever it could be, that's all Christianity. And that Jehovah's Witnesses have ruined the name of Christ in that community because of some of their interactions with people. And so those that are Islamic are sitting here more kind to people and more nice to people, and they're getting people by the droves that follow them over there in the United Kingdom. And it hit me that if we don't pay attention to how we treat people in America, we will be doing the exact same thing. Because let me tell you something, folks, if they don't like you, they will not like your God. And how you live and how you interact with people says everything you feel about what God did through Jesus Christ at Calvary and what he has done for us in our life. And if we go around treating people ugly and not valuing them, then they will look at us and they will say, I don't want to have anything to do with that God. The closer I get to them, the more I begin to love them. I like the way, this is that John 3:16-17, I like the way that this paraphrase goes. It says, God did not go to the trouble of sending his son merely to point an accusing finger, telling the world how bad it was. He came to help people, and he came to help put the world right again. That's our mission.
And that's why we were here. And the more and the closer I get to them, the more I love them. But the further I get away from them, the more I'll judge them. Closer I'll love, further I'll judge. Because this is what it comes down to. This last values lesson is simply this. Because it's the main one. I've got to value everyone. Folks, if you and I want to be like Jesus, if I want to be Christ-like, it begins and it ends with valuing people. If I want to be Christ-like, I've got to value everyone. When Jesus comes into Jericho in Luke 19, he looks up at Zacchaeus and says, I'm going to go eat with you today. And everybody else in town was like, what is he going? You see, because Zacchaeus was a crook. He stole things from people. He robbed people. He cheated people. And people couldn't believe that Jesus was going to eat with Zacchaeus. Understand this. The only people that had a problem with Jesus valuing everyone, watch it, was religious people. Because he wasn't hanging out enough with them. Jesus was hanging out with the sinners and the crooks. But that's exactly what he says in Luke chapter 19 and verse 10, that Jesus came, that the Son of Man was coming to seek and to save that which was lost. Let me explain something. When we die and we go to heaven, we're going to be hanging with Jesus for all eternity. We're going to be hanging with Christians and saved people for all eternity. We are here for a short few years on this earth, and there are over 7 billion people in this world, the majority of which needs to hear the message of Jesus. We have got to get out and interact with people that may not look like us, that may not talk like us, that may not act like us, but desperately need to hear Jesus. Share your faith now. The town couldn't understand why Jesus was hanging with Zacchaeus. The disciples didn't understand why Jesus was hanging with a Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. The religious people, the woman caught in adultery, the religious people were trying to write her off. Here's the cool part. The religious people were trying to write her off. Jesus was trying to write her into his story. Religion places people on the outside. And this is something that has become so near and dear to me that every congregation, every church I get to talk to, people I get to talk to, I am begging that we do not turn Christianity into religion. Please get what I'm saying. That we don't turn church into a place of religion, because religion places people on the outside and we build walls. Relationships place people on the inside and we build bridges. Do you see the difference? And it's all about people. It's all about relationships. Sometimes self-righteous people are seldomly aware. Let me beat this real quick to you. See if this will explain it. A man fell into a pit and couldn't get himself out. A subjective person said, I feel for you being in that pit. An objective person said, it's only logical that someone would fall into a pit. A Pharisee said, well, only bad people fall into a pit. A scientist says, you're only thinking. A news reporter came along and wanted to expose the story on the pit. A fundamentalist said, you deserve your pit. A charismatic said, confess you're not in a pit. A professor came along and gave him a lecture on the principles of the pit. A realist came along and said, wow, that's a pit. A geologist study a bit. An IRS man wanted to know if he was paying taxes on the pit. A city inspector asked if he had a permit for the pit. A self-pitying person said, "You ain't seen anything till you seen my pit." An optimist said, "Things could get worse," and a pessimist said, "Things are going to get worse." But Jesus saw the man in the pit, took him by the hand, lifted him out. I would hope this morning that God is talking to your heart. There are two things that I hope are happening today. First one is that we, as followers of Christ, that we would begin to see the big picture. That we value every person, God's creation. And the second thing is that if you're not a person of faith, you don't have a relationship with God, that I hope today that you're listening, and that I hope today that you feel valued by God and by others. Because I want you to know that God loves you so much that he sent his only son. He said, "Son, you got to go to earth. I want you to go to earth. I want you to teach people. I want you to interact with people. I want you to teach them great things. I want you to experience things. But son, you're going to have to die. Because the only way sin can be taken away from the lives of people is if I give my son, my only son, for salvation. That's what he did. And you may be here and you may be saying, "Well, John, you don't know my life. You don't know the brokenness. You don't realize what I have done and the things I've experienced." And you know what? You're right. I don't. But here's what I do know. I know what God can do for you. I know what Jesus wants to do in you. He wants to take away every sin. He wants to claim you as his own. He wants to bless your life immensely. Because he walked Calvary. Simple. It is simple as just repenting, confessing him, being baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. It's just that. It's simple. God values you so much. He sent Jesus so that we could have heaven. We can help him. Come with me together, stand as we sing. God sent his son, they called him Jesus. He answered to God, hear and forgive. Give and hide to